If you stand today in the Grand Hall of the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, you will see an exhibition of Chinese porcelain that takes your breath away. Delicate vases from the Qing Dynasty, jade sculptures that required a lifetime of craftsmanship, silk robes embroidered with dragons that seem to move in the light. These are the treasures of one of the world's greatest civilizations. The museum curators will tell you that these objects represent the cultural exchange between East and West. They will speak of trade and mutual respect. They will use words like partnership and commerce. But they will not tell you how these objects were paid for. They will not tell you that the silver used to purchase them was clawed back through the systematic poisoning of an entire nation. They will not mention that the tea service you see displayed in glass cases, the very symbol of British refinement, was subsidized by turning 40 million Chinese people into drug addicts. This is the story you will not find on the polished plaques of the museum. This is the story of how the British Empire, faced with a trade deficit it could not afford, made a calculated decision to weaponize narcotics. It is the story of how a government transformed itself into the world's largest drug cartel. And it is the story of how China, the richest and most advanced civilization on Earth in the year 1800, was brought to its knees not by superior culture or technology, but by opium. This is the story of the greatest drug trafficking operation in human history. It was not conducted by criminals in the shadows. It was conducted by men in top hats and military uniforms. It was planned in the boardrooms of London. It was executed by the Royal Navy. And when China tried to stop it, Britain went to war to protect the right to sell poison. To understand this crime, we must first understand the economic trap that led Britain to commit it. In the year 1700, Britain was a rising power, but still a relatively poor island on the edge of Europe. China, by contrast, was the wealthiest nation on Earth. The Qing Empire controlled a third of the world's economy. Its population was over 300 million people. Its cities were larger and more sophisticated than anything in Europe. The Chinese had invented paper, gunpowder, the compass, and printing centuries before the West. They had no need for European goods. They were self-sufficient, but Europe was obsessed with China. Specifically, Europe was obsessed with three things that only China could provide: tea, silk, and porcelain. These were not luxuries. By the 18th century, tea had become a necessity in Britain. The working classes drank it to stay awake during the brutal shifts of the Industrial Revolution. The upper classes drank it as a social ritual. The British government taxed tea imports heavily. The revenue from tea was funding the expansion of the empire, but there was a catastrophic problem. The Chinese emperor would only accept one form of payment: silver. The Qing court looked at British wool and said, "We have silk." They looked at British manufactured goods and said, "We make better." The emperor famously wrote to King George III, "We possess all things. I set no value on objects strange or ingenious and have no use for your country's manufactures." This was not arrogance, it was fact. China was the world's factory. They did not need imports. So British merchants had to pay in hard currency. Silver. Every year, millions of ounces of silver bullion left London. Ships sailed to Canton, their holds heavy with coins. They returned with tea, silk, and porcelain. But they returned with no payment except goods. This was a hemorrhage that threatened the British economy. By 1800, Britain was bleeding silver at an unsustainable rate. The Bank of England was alarmed. The trade deficit with China was draining the nation's reserves. The currency was under pressure. Inflation was rising. If this continued, Britain risked financial collapse. The directors of the East India Company, the quasi-governmental corporation that controlled British trade in Asia, held emergency meetings. They looked at their ledgers and they saw a problem that could not be solved by conventional means. They could not force China to buy British goods. They could not conquer China militarily. The Qing army numbered in the millions. So they needed a different weapon. They needed something that would make the Chinese buy from them. They needed something that would reverse the flow of silver. They found it growing in the fields of British-controlled India. Opium. The opium poppy had been cultivated for thousands of years. Its medical uses were well known. In small doses, it relieved pain, but in larger doses, it produced a euphoric high that was powerfully addictive. The Chinese had used opium for centuries, but only in tiny quantities for medicine. Recreational use was rare and socially condemned. Smoking opium was illegal under Chinese law. The penalty for trafficking was death. But the British saw an opportunity. If they could create a market for opium in China, they could get their silver back. And they controlled the perfect production base, the Bengal Presidency in India. The British colonial administration in India turned opium production into an industrial operation of staggering scale. This was not the work of individual criminals. This was a government monopoly. The East India Company forced Indian farmers in the regions of Bihar and Bengal to dedicate their land to poppy cultivation. Farmers who wanted to grow food were told they had no choice. The company controlled the land. The company set the prices. The company took the crop. We have records from British officials describing the system. One district magistrate wrote, "The riots, the peasants, are compelled to cultivate the poppy. They receive advances which bind them. If they refuse, they are coerced." This was slavery by another name. Entire regions of India were turned into narcotics plantations to fuel Britain's war on China. The processing of the opium was done with industrial precision. 2 massive factories were built at Patna and Gazipur. These were not hidden operations. They were official government facilities. Travelers who visited the Gazipur factory in the 1830s described it as a city unto itself. The main building was over 300 feet long. Inside, thousands of workers labored in shifts. The raw opium sap was collected from the poppy fields. It was boiled, filtered, and shaped into balls. Each ball weighed exactly 3 pounds. Each ball was stamped with the seal of the East India Company. The seal showed a British lion. It was a mark of quality, a guarantee that the product was pure and potent. The British were branding their poison just as they would brand tea or textiles. The scale of production was staggering. By 1820, the factories were producing 4,000 chests of opium per year. By 1830, it was 20,000 chests. By 1838, it was 40,000 chests. Each chest contained 140 pounds of opium. That is 5–6 million pounds of narcotics being manufactured annually by the British government. To put that in perspective, that is more opium than the entire global illegal drug trade produces today. And this was legal, this was official, this was the British Empire, but the British faced a problem. How do you sell a product that is illegal in the country you are selling it to? The solution was a masterpiece of criminal logistics. The East India Company could not be seen directly smuggling drugs into China. That would be too blatant. So they created a system of plausible deniability. The company did not ship the opium to China themselves. Instead, they held public auctions in Calcutta. Private merchants bid on the chests. These men were the smugglers. They were British, Scottish, American, and Parsi traders, men like William Jardine and James Matheson. Jardine was a former ship's surgeon from Scotland. He had a brilliant mind for business and a total absence of conscience. Matheson was his partner. Together, they founded a company that would become one of the most powerful corporations in Asia. Jardine Matheson. Today, Jardine Matheson is a legitimate multinational conglomerate, but it was built on drug money. Jardine bought opium from the East India Company and smuggled it into China on fast, armed clipper ships. The smugglers did not sail into Chinese ports. That was too risky. Instead, they anchored offshore at a remote island called Linton near the mouth of the Pearl River. The island became a floating drug market. The British ships sat at anchor, their holds full of opium. Chinese smugglers, local gang members, and corrupt officials would row out in small boats. They would buy the opium and transport it inland through secret channels. The British captains never set foot on Chinese soil. They never broke Chinese law on Chinese territory. It was smuggling with a legal shield, and the silver came pouring in. The scheme worked perfectly. By the 1830s, The trade deficit had reversed. British merchants were no longer paying silver to China. Chinese addicts were paying silver to Britain. The balance of trade tipped. The flow of silver reversed direction. But the cost to China was apocalyptic. Opium addiction spread like a plague. In the southern provinces, entire towns were consumed by the drug. We have reports from Chinese officials of the time. One magistrate wrote, "In my district, 8 out of 10 men smoke opium. The soldiers do not train. The farmers do not plant. The merchants do not trade. They lie on their beds all day, inhaling the smoke, waiting for death." The social impact was devastating. The Chinese family structure, which had been the foundation of society for millennia, began to collapse. Sons sold their father's land to buy opium. Husbands abandoned their wives. Mothers neglected their children. Crime exploded. Addicts who could not afford the drug turned to theft, prostitution, and murder. The economic damage was even worse. The silver that was the lifeblood of the Chinese economy was vanishing. For centuries, China had been a net importer of silver. Silver from the Americas flowed into China to pay for exports. This silver stabilized the currency and funded the government. But now, the silver was flowing out. By the 1830s, China was losing tens of millions of ounces of silver every year. This caused deflation. The price of goods collapsed. Farmers could not sell their crops. Tax revenue fell. The government could not pay its soldiers. The entire economy began to contract. The Qing Empire, which had been the richest nation on earth, was being hollowed out from the inside, and the British were counting the profits. The Emperor Daiguang watched his empire crumble. He was not a weak man. He was not ignorant. He understood exactly what was happening. The barbarians from the West were destroying his nation with poison. He held councils with his advisors. They debated solutions. Some said negotiate. Some said increase the penalties. But the emperor knew that half measures would not work. The problem was existential. If the opium trade continued, China would cease to exist as a functioning state. In 1838, the emperor made a decision. He would stop the trade, completely, permanently, whatever the cost. He turned to the one man in his government who could not be bought, a scholar official named Lin Zexu. Lin Zexu was in his 50s. He was a poet, a Confucian scholar, and a man of absolute integrity. He was known as Lin Qingshan, Blue Sky Lin, because his honesty was as clear as the heavens. He had served as governor in several provinces. Everywhere he went, he rooted out corruption. He punished officials who took bribes. He closed opium dens. He was feared and respected. The emperor gave Lin the title of Imperial Commissioner. He gave him emergency powers. He gave him a mandate to wipe out the opium trade by any means necessary. Lin understood the stakes. He later wrote, "If we continue to allow this trade, in a few dozen years, we will not only have no soldiers to fight, we will have no silver to equip them." Lin arrived in Canton in March 1839. He did not come to negotiate. His first move was to target the Chinese side of the trade. He arrested over 1,600 Chinese dealers. He confiscated their property. He ordered addicts to register for rehabilitation. He set up treatment centers where users were given medicine and forced to break the habit. He executed the worst offenders. He made it clear that the age of tolerance was over, but Lin knew that arresting Chinese dealers was not enough. The real criminals were the foreign merchants, the men who sat on their ships at Linton, protected by British guns, pumping poison into China. Lin decided to go after the source. He issued an ultimatum to the foreign traders: surrender all the opium in your possession. Sign a bond promising never to trade opium again. If you refuse, you will be arrested and executed according to Chinese law. The British merchants laughed at him. They were used to Chinese officials who could be bribed or intimidated. They assumed Lin was bluffing. They did not believe the Chinese government had the power or the will to enforce its laws against foreigners. They were wrong. Lin deployed troops to surround the foreign factories in Canton. These were the warehouses and residences where the British, American, and other foreign traders lived. Lin cut off all supplies: no food, no water, no communication with the outside world. He posted guards at every exit. He turned the foreign quarter into a prison. The British merchants panicked. They were trapped. They sent urgent messages to the British Superintendent of Trade, Captain Charles Elliot. Elliot was the official representative of the British government in China. He rushed to Canton to negotiate, but Lin Zexu would not negotiate. He told Elliot, "You have 3 days. Surrender the opium or face the consequences." Elliot realized he had no choice. He ordered the British merchants to hand over their entire stock. The merchants protested. They said, "This is theft. This is our property." Elliot made them a promise. He said, "The British government will compensate you. The Crown will pay you for every chest you surrender. Just give it to him." It was a promise that would cost China dearly, because Elliot was effectively turning a private commercial loss into a debt owed by the British government. Over the next few weeks, the British merchants surrendered over 20,000 chests of opium. This was an unimaginable fortune. At market prices, it was worth over £9 million sterling. In today's money, that is over $1 billion. It was the largest drug bust in history. Lin Zexu had the chests transporting to a beach at Humen, near Canton. He ordered 3 massive trenches to be dug in the sand. Each trench was 150 feet long, 75 feet wide, and 7 feet deep. The opium balls were broken open and thrown into the trenches. Then workers poured in lime and salt. The mixture was stirred with long poles. The chemical reaction caused the opium to dissolve into a thick, toxic sludge. Then, at low tide, the sluice gates were opened. The sludge washed into the Pearl River and out to sea. It took 23 days to destroy it all. While the work proceeded, Lin Zexu sat in his tent and wrote. He wrote prayers to the sea gods, apologizing for polluting their waters. And he wrote a letter to Queen Victoria. The letter is one of the most morally powerful documents of the 19th century. Lin addressed the Queen not as a barbarian to a civilized monarch, but as a man of principle to a woman he hoped shared his values. He wrote, "I have heard that smoking opium is strictly forbidden in your own country. This means you are aware of its harm. Under these circumstances, how can you bear to sell it to other lands? How can you let it poison the people of other nations?" Lin appealed to her sense of justice. He said, "The way of heaven is fairness to all. It does not allow one to harm others in order to benefit oneself." He assumed that if the Queen knew the truth, she would stop the trade. He assumed that the ruler of a great nation would not knowingly destroy another country for profit. The letter was sent to London. We do not know if Queen Victoria ever read it. There is no record of a reply. It likely gathered dust in some Foreign Office filing cabinet, but even if she had read it, it would not have changed anything. Because in London, the destruction of the opium was not seen as a justified act of law enforcement. It was seen as an act of war. When the news reached Britain, the reaction was immediate and furious. The merchants who had lost their opium did not hide in shame. They went on the offensive. William Jardine traveled to London personally. He began a lobbying campaign that would make modern corporate lobbyists look like amateurs. He had meetings with the Foreign Secretary, Lord Palmerston. He unfolded maps of the Chinese coast. He pointed to the harbors and the cities. He told Palmerston that the Chinese military was weak. He said they had no modern navy. Their forts were armed with ancient cannons. Their soldiers used matchlock muskets and bows. He promised that a small British fleet could bring the Qing Empire to its knees in a matter of months, and he presented a bill. Jardine and the other merchants demanded compensation from the British government. Elliot had promised to pay them back. Now they were calling in the debt. The total was over £9 million. The British government was broke. The Treasury was under pressure. They could not afford to simply pay the merchants out of pocket. They needed to get the money from somewhere, so they decided to get it from China. Lord Palmerston drafted a letter to the Chinese emperor. It was not a request. It was a demand. It said, "You have destroyed British property. You have insulted the British flag. You will pay compensation. You will reopen the opium trade. And you will cede territory to Britain as a base of operations. If you refuse, we will take it by force." The emperor refused. He said, "We have laws. You broke them. We will not pay you for the poison you smuggled. In the summer of 1840, a British fleet sailed from India to China. It was not a large fleet by European standards, just 16 warships and 4,000 soldiers, but it was more than enough. Because the British had a weapon the Chinese could not match, steam power. At the head of the fleet was a ship called the Nemesis. It was the first ocean-going iron-hulled warship in the world. It was powered by steam engines. It could sail up rivers. It could maneuver in shallow water where wooden sailing ships could not go. It was armed with heavy cannons and Congreve rockets. To the Chinese defenders, it looked like a demon. The Nemesis steamed up the coast of China, bombarding forts and seizing ports. The Chinese Navy, which consisted of wooden junks powered by sail and oar, was annihilated. The Chinese soldiers fought bravely, but they were armed with weapons that had not changed in 200 years. Their cannonballs bounced off the iron hull of the Nemesis. Their matchlock muskets had a range of 50 yards. The British rifles had a range of 300 yards. It was not a war, it was a slaughter. The British strategy was simple. They did not try to conquer China. They did not need to, they just needed to strangle it. They blockaded the Grand Canal, the waterway that transporting grain from the south to Beijing. They threatened to starve the capital. They seized the coastal cities. They burned the forts. And they sent a message: pay us, or we will destroy your empire piece by piece. The Chinese generals were in shock. They could not understand how a small force of barbarians could defeat the armies of the Middle Kingdom so easily. The Qing military was massive. Millions of soldiers, but they were equipped for a different kind of war. A war of swords and spears and cavalry, not a war of steam and steel. By 1842, the British fleet had sailed up the Yangtze River. They were within striking distance of Nanjing, the southern capital. The British commander sent an ultimatum: surrender now, or we will burn Nanjing to the ground. The emperor capitulated. On August 29, 1842, Chinese officials boarded the British warship HMS Cornwallis. Under the guns of the Royal Navy, they signed the Treaty of Nanking. It is known in China as the first of the unequal treaties. The terms were dictated by the victors. China was forced to pay an indemnity of 21 million silver dollars. Of that, 6 million was specifically for the opium that Lin Zexu had destroyed. Let that sink in. The British government forced China to pay for the drugs that had been smuggled into their country illegally. It was a protection racket on a national scale. China was forced to open 5 treaty ports where British merchants could live and trade. And most fatefully, China was forced to cede a barren island off the southern coast to Britain in perpetuity. The island was called Hong Kong. The British Foreign Secretary, Lord Palmerston, was initially disappointed. He had wanted a major commercial city. He called Hong Kong a barren rock with hardly a house upon it, but the drug smugglers knew better. Hong Kong was the perfect base. Under the protection of the British flag, they could build warehouses and docks. They could operate without fear of Chinese law. Hong Kong became the operational headquarters of the opium cartel, and the trade exploded. In the years following the treaty, opium imports into China did not decrease. They skyrocketed. By the 1850s, Britain was exporting over 50,000 chests per year. By the 1880s, it was over 80,000 chests. Over 11 million pounds of opium every year. The revenue from this trade became the financial backbone of British India. It paid for the railroads. It paid for the civil service. It paid for the British Army in Asia. The human cost was incalculable. By the late 19th century, it is estimated that 10% of the Chinese population was addicted to opium. That is over 40 million people. In some provinces, the addiction rate was over 25%. Entire generations were lost. The economic damage was permanent. The silver drain continued for decades. The Chinese economy stagnated. Infrastructure crumbled. Famines became more frequent and more deadly. The weakened Qing government could not respond to internal rebellions. The Taiping Rebellion, one of the deadliest wars in human history, was partly fueled by the social chaos caused by opium. Over 20 million people died in that war. China descended into what is known as the Century of Humiliation. It was a period of civil war, foreign invasion, and national collapse that lasted until 1949. The psychological trauma was as deep as the economic damage. For thousands of years, the Chinese had viewed themselves as the center of civilization. They called their country Zhongguo, the Middle Kingdom. They believed they were the peak of human achievement. But the Opium Wars shattered that worldview. They had been defeated not by a superior culture, but by drug dealers with gunboats. The humiliation burned into the Chinese national consciousness. It is still there today. When Chinese leaders speak of national rejuvenation, they are speaking of reversing the century of humiliation. When they speak of sovereignty and territorial integrity, they are remembering the Treaty of Nanking. When they warn against foreign interference, they are remembering the British warships on the Yangtze River. But what of the men who orchestrated this crime? Did they face justice? On the contrary, William Jardine, the drug smuggler, returned to England a hero. He was elected to Parliament. He died wealthy and respected. His partner, James Matheson, became a baronet. He bought an entire Scottish island and built a castle. The company they founded, Jardine Matheson, did not disappear. It evolved. It moved from opium into shipping, real estate, and finance. Today, Jardine Matheson is one of the largest conglomerates in Asia. It is listed on the stock exchange. It owns hotels, supermarkets, and car dealerships. If you visit Hong Kong, you will see the Jardine House, a skyscraper in the financial district. It has distinctive round windows that locals call the House of 1,000 Assholes. The building stands as a monument to the drug money that built modern Hong Kong. There is a bitter irony in the end of the opium trade. By the early 20th century, the moral campaign against opium finally gained political power in Britain. Missionary groups and religious organizations lobbied the government to stop the exports. In 1906, Britain agreed to phase out the opium trade. By 1917, it was over. But they did not stop it because they suddenly found a conscience. They stopped it because it was no longer profitable. China had started growing its own opium. By the 1890s, domestic Chinese opium production exceeded British imports. The British had taught the Chinese how to poison themselves, and the Chinese had learned the lesson too well. The British also stopped because international pressure was mounting. The United States, which was horrified by the opium trade in its own immigrant communities, pushed for global drug control treaties. But the damage was done. The silver had been extracted. The economy had been ruined. The society had been fractured, and the British Empire had pocketed the profits. The Pax Britannica, the great era of British peace and prosperity in the 19th century, was built on the bones of Chinese addicts. The grand homes of London, the country estates of Scotland, the universities and museums and railways of Britain were all funded, in part, by the systematic drugging of a nation. When we look at the great monuments of Victorian Britain, we should remember that they were built with silver soaked in opium smoke. The story of the Opium Wars teaches us a lesson that echoes through history. It teaches us that free trade is not a moral principle. It is a weapon. It can be used to build or to destroy. It teaches us that sovereignty is not a given. It is a privilege that can be taken away by anyone with superior firepower and a product to sell. And it teaches us that the line between a legitimate government and a criminal cartel is thinner than we like to believe. In the 19th century, the British government made a choice. They chose profit over principle. They chose silver over morality. They chose to become the largest drug cartel in human history, and they got away with it. The ghosts of the opium dens have not vanished. They linger in the suspicion that still colors the relationship between China and the West. They linger in the memory of a civilization that was brought low not by conquest, but by commerce. They remind us that empire is not just about flags and armies. It is about control. Control of markets, control of currency,